Okay, so we're working on number 8 here, trying to come up with a counterexample that would make the premises come out true and the conclusion come out false. All right, so let's say we list some of the some greatest bands of 60s. Rolling Stones, Beatles, The Who, The Grateful Dead, Led Zeppelin, who am I forgetting? The Doors, and the Beach Boys, and the Mamas and the Papas. Okay, now imagine that at Monterey, the following bands played: Rolling Stones, Who, Led Zeppelin, and the Beach Boys, and that's it. Okay, so this is the counterexample. It's describing a situation, right? The first aspect of the counterexample is this one, that we list some of the greatest bands of the 60s. Second, we list some of the bands, or all of the bands that played at Monterey, right? And now, if you look at the premises, Monterey Pop had some of the greatest bands of the 60s. That, right, here's who played at Monterey: Rolling Stones, Who, Led Zeppelin, Beach Boys. Those are some of the greatest bands of the 60s. So the first premise is true on our counterexample. Second premise, Beatles didn't perform at Monterey. That's also true because this is an exhaustive list of who performed at Monterey. So the second premise is true. Beatles were not a great band of the 60s. That is indeed false because on our list of some of the great bands of the 60s, right, there are the Beatles, right? So this counterexample where we listed some of the greatest bands of the 60s and we listed who played at Monterey Pop, makes both premises come out true, makes the conclusion come out false, and that's enough to prove that it is an invalid argument. Now, again, notice that these facts I'm listing in the counterexample, I shouldn't even use the word facts. These claims I'm listing in the counterexample, I don't know if they're true or false, right? It doesn't matter if they're true or false, because again, the whole point of valid, invalid is a question of possibility. Is it possible the premises could be true and the conclusion could be false? And if this were the scenario, then the premises would be true and the conclusion would be false. So it is possible, and that's what makes it invalid. Okay, number 10. Only Hell's Angels live in the Brentwood apartments. Hank belongs to the Hell's Angels. Therefore, Hank must live in the Brentwood apartments. Right? Okay. So, again, premises, only Hell's Angels live in Brentwood apartments. Hank is a Hell's Angel. Conclusion, Hank must live in Brentwood apartments, right? So that's the argument. Again, therefore is a conclusion indicator word. So again, can we describe a counterexample or draw a picture or whatever that would show us that it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false? Okay, so again, let's do the scenario thing. So every apartment in Brentwood Apartments is lived in by a Hell's Angel. All right, this is our counterexample, right? We're just seeing if it's possible to come up with a situation that would make the premises true and the conclusion false. So in our counterexample, it's true that every apartment in Brentwood Apartments is lived in by a Hells Angel. So only Hells Angels live in the Brentwood Apartments. So far, so good. Now, let's also make it the case that some Hells Angels live in a building across the street from the Brentwood Apartments. Let's call it Melrose Place, for those of you old enough to get the reference. All right. Hank is in the Hells Angels. Hank lives in Melrose Place. Okay, so now the question is, have we described a situation that's going to make the premises come out true and the conclusion come out false? Okay, only Hells Angels live in Brentwood Apartments. Yes, our counterexample does specify that every apartment in the Brentwood Apartments is lived in by a Hells Angel, so that's true. Nobody who's not a Hells Angel lives in Brentwood Apartments. Hank is a Hells Angel. Yes, that is also specified here, so that comes out true, right? So this one makes the first one true. This makes the second premise true. But our conclusion, as you can see now, is false. Why? Because Hank doesn't live in Brentwood Apartments. He lives in Melrose Place. So again, it's possible then to come up with a scenario that would make the premises true and the conclusion false. So that makes it an invalid argument. Now notice one thing that would change this argument, though, is if you put the only over here. If you said Hells Angels only live in Brentwood Apartments, right? And Hank belongs to the Hells Angels, therefore he lives in Brentwood Apartments, that would be a valid argument. So just the placement of the word only there makes a big difference, right? But this doesn't say they only live in Brentwood Apartments. It says only Hells Angels live in Brentwood Apartments. It doesn't leave out the possibility that some other Hells Angels live elsewhere. And that's why it's an invalid argument. Okay, number 12. All the members of the Ohio Southpaw Club are left-handed. Joe is left-handed, so Joe must be a member of the Ohio Southpaw Club. So again, so is a conclusion indicator word. All members of OSC are left-handed. Joe is left-handed. Oops, conclusion, Joe is a member of O. So that's our argument. Again, we want to see if it's possible to make both premises come out true and the conclusion come out false. And this is somewhat similar to the previous example, and maybe we'll try doing this one again with circles, because the first premise says all members of this club are left-handed. So if we draw the circle that represents all the left-handed people, we know that the OSC members are going to be inside of it. Right? So that's what the first premise says. All members of the OSC are left-handed. So the set representing the membership of OSC is completely inside the set representing people who are left-handed. Next, Joe is left-handed. So now we can put a little spot here, and that spot represents Joe. My writing is as terrible here as it is in the chalkboard. And now, hopefully you can see that the way we've drawn this circle makes the premises come out true and the conclusion come out false. So the first premise is true since this circle is inside of this circle. Second premise is true since Joe is inside of the circle of left-handed people. but the conclusion is false since Joe is not inside of the OSC circle. So again, this is a representation of how the premises of this argument can both be true and the conclusion could be false. And so again, it's an invalid argument. Circles generally work okay if you have like alls and nones and sums and things like words like that. They don't necessarily work for all arguments. So, okay, last one. Every member of the Little Bill in the Blue Notes is elected to the Hall of Fame. Stapleton has been elected to the Hall of Fame, therefore he's a member of the group, right? So, so every member of LB and the B has been elected to NBHF, right? Billy Stapleton has been elected to NBHF, therefore conclusion, Billy S must be a member of LB and B. All right, so that's the argument, and the question of validity and validity is a question of, is it possible, again, not are these premises actually true or false, but is it possible to come up with a scenario in which the premises come out true and the conclusion comes out false? This one looks pretty damn similar to this one. In other words, we probably could draw a pretty similar picture, right? So if we draw our first circle, and the first circle represents membership in the NBHF, Northwest Blues Hall of Fame. So this circle represents everybody who's ever been elected to that Hall of Fame, and we know, or we want to make it so that every member of Little Billy and the whatever's Blue Notes is inside of this circle, right? So that makes the first premise true. Every member of LB and B is a member of the Hall of Fame. This circle is inside this circle. Now we do the same thing, right? We put Billy S out here. All right, so Billy S, he's inside the NBHF circle, so that means the second premise comes out true. But again, he's not inside this circle. So that means the conclusion does indeed come out false. So that is an invalid argument. Okay, and again, this whole, I keep repeating this thing about possibility. It's really important that you remember with validity, we're not talking about whether the premises are actually true or false. Okay, that's soundness. After we evaluate for validity, if we do find the argument's valid, then we look and see if it's sound. All right. So the only valid argument we saw here was number 4, right? And the argument has a premise that the U.S. House of Representatives has more than 366 members, and that is indeed true, right? So this is in fact a true sentence because there are, like, I think 435 members, if I'm not mistaken, and 435 is more than 366. So this is in fact true. So because it's a valid argument, and now because the premise, there's only one premise, is true, that means it is also a sound argument. Okay. So that comes later. Soundness is when you worry about whether stuff is actually true or false. Validity, though, you don't care if stuff is actually true or false. You just see if it's possible to make the premises true and the conclusion false.